Welcome to Session 2 of Module 10, where we will be introducing the concepts of climate change and of green growth. The objective for this session is to present an overview of what climate change is and why it is important. The second objective is to provide the different approaches to tackling climate change, which are adaptation, mitigation, and then green growth. So let's begin by understanding what is climate change. If you can see the graphs in this slide, you will see that there are some lines going up, and these lines indicate a change in temperature of the Earth for the last 140 years in the upper graph. And in the lower graph, where it goes down and then suddenly goes up, this is the Earth's temperature for the last 1,000 years. So scientists have been describing the climate in terms of specific properties. And then over time, is there a change in the mean or a variability in these properties, they ask themselves. If they can find that difference, then they say that the climate is changing. So this change has to persist for a long period of time, not just happen from year to year or day to day. It has to be a long-term change. And they usually use the idea of decades, change over decades. So this means that when there is a change in the overall climate, then there's something to worry about, because this will lead to the impacts on society. So now we go to the idea of why it is important to address climate change. As the IPCC, or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have described the situation, they find that there will be shifts in temperature and precipitation, first of all. Okay, so these shifts in temperature and precipitation will bring other impacts. So if the shift is towards warming, there will be, for example, a tendency for our vegetation to respond to these changes. Now, will our vegetation be ready for a warmer climate, or are they used to a colder climate? If they're not used to a warmer climate, perhaps they will die. But then other vegetation may take its place. So then we have an idea of change in our environment that results from a change in the temperature. Okay, now if this change is beneficial to us, for example, in the United Kingdom, they are now growing grapes and they are restarting a wine industry, then they can benefit from this change in temperature, which has enabled them to grow grapes where before they could not. But if this change in temperature will mean that there will be more water melting off from glaciers and creating floods, or perhaps it will mean that the land we live in will be warm enough for mosquitoes to breed and other disease-carrying species, then it may have impacts on our well-being, because these disease-carrying species can infect us. So therefore, there are certain sectors that have been earmarked as most likely being affected by climate change. And these sectors are the following: health, agriculture, forestry, water resources, the coastal areas, and finally the species and natural areas themselves. So that the changes there may be happening in a way that's too fast for us to be able to cope with. Okay. This means that we have to prepare ourselves for these possible changes. And what the changes are, we will explore in the next session, not in this session. So the other aspect that we need to consider when it comes to climate change is the idea of greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon dioxide. These greenhouse gases are released by human activity, especially when we burn oil, coal, wood, any kind of fossil fuel energy. It releases carbon dioxide, and this gas will accumulate in the upper atmosphere. And then these gases will trap heat inside, and that's what leads supposedly to the warming of the Earth, and then all the impacts that I had just mentioned previously. Okay, so then what scientists are proposing that we do as a society is to reduce the amount of gases that we are currently injecting into the world. And then that means we have to deal with how much fossil fuel that we burn. Secondly, the idea of carbon sinks has been discussed as a way of capturing all of this carbon that is floating around. Well, perhaps not all of the carbon, but at least enough so that the balance may be restored in our environment. So how do we capture this carbon? Is there some net that we use? Well, we use the natural carbon cycle as the idea. Mainly, living beings tend to use carbon as part of our lives, and especially plants and other kinds of vegetation need carbon in their energy cycle. So that the recommendation is that we maintain large areas of vegetation such as forests and fields of grasses, other kinds of vegetation that will be storing this carbon, making the carbon sink down from the atmosphere back into the ground. So then we are looking at how to promote the creation of carbon sinks and how to monitor the clearing away of carbon sinks through fire or through deforestation. So this means we have to think of 3 general responses to climate change. The first one is adaptation. We adapt. We adapt to the climate impacts in a changing environment. The second one is called mitigation, which means we will try to reduce the greenhouse gases that we eject into the atmosphere. And finally, we should think about green growth. It is a paradigm for development where we will aim to reduce our carbon emissions, strengthen our climate resilience, or how strong we are against the impacts of climate change. And finally, we look at how to increase the sustainability of development. But green growth does not mean that we pursue these 3 things independently. Actually, what we are thinking about is how to integrate them into one, so that economic development does not mean environmental degradation, but that rather we promote both the economy and the environment, and in so doing, we promote the well-being of our society. So that is the subject matter of this module, and then we will be looking at how ICTs are going to be applied into these 3 different responses to climate change: adaptation, mitigation, and green growth.